Thank you for joining us again in our series on World War I, and it's going to continue to World War II. Before we get started on the new weapons and technology involved in World War I, I'd just like to add that based on a question for the previous lecture, is that when I used the statistics for the United Kingdom, I included the Canadian, the New Zealand, the South African, and the Australian soldiers in those. And I will also have two particular lessons dealing with the Canadian forces in World War I and their importance to the Allies. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the new weapons. I'd like to start out in that this was a war of technology and invention, and one of the first things, a very, very terrible weapon that was used was poison gas. Poison gas was first used in April 1915, just outside of Belgium. Later, it will be used by all sides. It was never used in World War II, and one of the reasons it wasn't used in World War II is because Corporal Adolf Hitler in World War I was gassed twice. In fact, he was in prison, or not prison, excuse me, he was in the hospital when the war ended in November 1918. So today, let's talk about poison gas. The first poison gas that was used in April 1915 against the Algerians and Canadians was a poison gas that was emitted from bomblets, large containers that they would open, and with the wind blowing toward the enemy lines, distribute the poison chlorine gas. Later on, they will have artillery shells that will land and explode and also distribute poison gas. But at least in the first case, in April 1915, they were released. So therefore, when you release poison gas, you better make sure that the wind is blowing in the right direction, that it's blowing toward the enemy. And occasionally, forces in World War I would experience the fact that they would release poison gas, and the wind would change, and they would feel the effects of the poison gas. Initially, during a poison gas attack, there was no way to protect yourself. Some of the scientists on the Canadian side mentioned to the Canadian soldiers that urinating in their bandage and holding it over their mouth and nose would in fact dissipate it, and it did work. But obviously, very, very few soldiers did that, and the casualties were enormous. The Algerians actually broke during that attack. The Canadians filled their gap during that attack and kind of saved the line for the Allies, but suffered tremendous casualties. As I said before, though, all sides will use poison gas during the war. The next item I'd like to bring out is the machine gun. And let me show you a picture of a machine gun, and it's appropriate because the machine gun here is being fired by two members of the armed services, British armed services, that are wearing protective masks. Protective masks obviously became common once both sides started using gas widely. And you also see this machine gun. It's a water-cooled machine gun. You see the big ring around the barrel. That was to cool off the machine gun, because the machine gun could fire anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 rounds per minute at a target. And machine guns were not just firing randomly at targets. They were generally staked along the trench line with stakes, literally, and they would fire up to that stake and stop, and fire back toward the next stake and stop. And these machine guns were staked in such a way along the line that they would cover the entire frontage. And so it was very, very difficult to escape machine gun fire during any attack. And that's one of the reasons why there were so many tragic casualties during that time period. The next important object of war was artillery. Artillery cannon, basically firing. Heretofore, during the Civil War, it was indirect, or it was direct fire. In other words, you had to see a target to be able to fire at it. During the time of the World War I, it's indirect fire. And here are some of the shells that are fired. These are pieces taken actually from Belgium and France. And this is a piece of shrapnel right here, again found in the fields.
What is shrapnel?
A shrapnel is a piece of the shell. So when the shell hits the ground, or it has a fuse to explode over the lines, it will break into many different parts. And so this would have been a part of an artillery shell along the way. You can see that only this part of the shell was left. The rest of it was in many different pieces. Here's a photograph of an artillery piece. What's important to understand is this is indirect artillery fire. Unlike in the Civil War where you're seeing the target that you're shooting at, these guns could fire 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles, even 20 miles away at a target. That target information was given to the gunners via, again, a modern system, communications. They had hardwire lines from artillery observers at the front that would communicate back to the guns, giving them grid coordinates. And so the gun would fire a shell. If it was too long, they'd say drop 25 yards and then fire again. And then when it was right on, they would say fire for effect. And then all the guns would be firing at that area. 60% of all casualties, again, were killed by flying bits of shrapnel like this. 60% of all casualties in World War I were due to, in fact, artillery. The second thing I'd like to talk about as far as small arms has to do with the bullets that were fired. These are bolt-action rifles that are firing these shells. These again were found on the near the Somme battlefield, famous battlefield in 1916. You can see this one has already been fired. It's got an indentation there. This is a bullet that was found in the ground there. And then finally, this is one that has not been fired. Both the English, and when I say English, I mean the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, and Australians, used a .303 Enfield rifle. Canadians used another rifle very, very early in the war and proved unsatisfactory, so they picked up the .303 Enfield, and the Germans used the Mauser. This was a bolt-action rifle, which fired anywhere between 6 and 8 rounds. You had to bolt the cartridge out and insert another one and then fire each time. But you could do that. A good rifleman could fire up to 20 rounds per minute during this time. So again, in combination with the machine guns, artillery, and the rifles, you can see how difficult it must have been to be successful in an attack. And in fact, the lines remain the same for almost the entire war. The next item I'd like to talk about are grenades. Grenades were hand thrown, almost like a baseball. They were metal, obviously. There were different types of grenades. They generally weren't called grenades in World War I. They were oftentimes called stick bombs because you've heard of the potato masher. It looked like a potato masher. It was a wooden handle with a grenade on top. That was the German variety, and they would throw it into the lines. Now, some of these grenades wouldn't go very far because it was about as far as you could throw a baseball, even less because of the weight of the grenade. The early grenades, when they first started, were round, flat grenades with metal, with cartridges in them, and you would fly them or throw them just like a disc to the other line. But if it didn't strike that cartridge just right, you'd probably get that grenade thrown back to you, and it could go back 2 or 3 times before it exploded. And so, but grenades are used in close attack, generally in combination. When you're attacking, when you're getting near the trench, you're throwing that grenade. Trench mortars are also an item. Trench mortars are short, fat objects here, oftentimes almost homemade of sorts, and you drop a artillery shell into the trench mortar on a spike like that. It would hit the firing pin and shoot the mortared object into the enemy lines. It would explode there just like an artillery shell right here and destroy, obviously, the trench. Trench mortars were generally used as a close range weapon where they would only be firing at objects anywhere from 100 yards to 400 yards away. It wasn't very far away. They were oftentimes used to lob shells. They called them lobbing in those days. Airplanes were also used during World War I. We're going to have a whole class about famous air pilots during World War I, anywhere from Billy Bishop, the famous Canadian, to Rickenbacker, the famous American, and of course Manfred von Richthofen. And some of you are familiar with him as the Red Baron. Some of you know about Snoopy and the Red Baron, and that's going to be talked about later on. but airplanes were an important weapon during the First World War also. Balloons were also an important object and used extensively by both sides. Balloons were oftentimes used to observe what was happening on the other side. And so they were on tethers, meaning they were on a type of rope, and they were sent up with an observer underneath the balloon. And he was supposed to either see what was going on the other side, especially if they thought the enemy was massing troops and getting ready for attack, but also more importantly, oftentimes to coordinate artillery observation. In other words, because these artillery shells were going such long distances, as I talked about before, they'd send up the balloonists. Now, the balloonists had an interesting thing that was also an invention, or not an invention, but used for the first time in World War I. That was called the parachute. And so if an enemy aircraft came along to shoot down the balloons, and many times they did, and they were called balloon busters, the individual that was in the balloon could jump from the balloon and safely land because he had a parachute. Can you believe that parachutes were not allowed to be given to any of the pilots flying regular aircraft? And that was, both sides decided they weren't going to do that because they thought the pilots would jump too soon and not land the aircraft, and even if they were shot at a little bit, they'd jump out of their aircraft if they had a parachute. And so no parachutes were given to pilots, whether they were German pilots, English pilots, Canadian pilots, American pilots, during the entire First World War. They did not have parachutes. Even though they were there, the only people that wore parachutes were the balloonists. The next and probably the most significant new weapon of World War I was the tank. So you can see the tank here, and you can see another tank in a tactical setting here. Obviously, the one in a tactical setting had some difficulty. Why were they called tanks? Well, when they were first deployed, and they were again first deployed in the Canadian sector in 1916 in a place called Courcelette, they were deployed there secretly. They didn't want to let the Germans know that they had this weapon, and so when they shipped the few machines over that were going to be the tanks of the future, they wrote down that they were tanks. In other words, water tanks. And so that was their code name. They were codenamed water tanks. And so during the battle, they ended up being called tanks, and that's why we still have that word with us today. Tanks were a number of, there were different varieties of tanks. Two varieties mainly. There were male tanks and female tanks. So there's sex even among the tanks. You can see that the tank here is a male tank because it has a large gun there. A female tank had machine guns, smaller machine guns, but not a large gun there. Generally, there were about a 4 to 5 man crew in a tank. It was very hot. They had very significant problems attacking, particularly in mud, and oftentimes could not go through a trench line, as you see from this tank here, where it gets stuck often. If a tank is stuck, he becomes very vulnerable, obviously, to artillery fire and to even people jumping on the tanks with hand grenades and throwing hand grenades in the various portals that are on the tank. So the tanks were not very reliable during the First World War. Later on in the First World War, they will be used in greater numbers and in some cases achieve some success, but certainly they aren't anything like what we're used to seeing later on in 1939, 1940, 41, and throughout the Second World War, where tanks were used extensively. Submarines were also an item that was a technological achievement during the First World War. They were particularly used to offset the great naval advantage that Great Britain had over Germany. Germany had tried to catch up to the Navy of Great Britain prior to the World War I, but had not. And so they tried to even the score a little bit by using submarines. Submarines were a devastatingly new weapon used for the first time. Certainly they had been invented all the way back to the Revolutionary War and used in the Civil War one time, but it never been used extensively as they were in the First World War, where again technology allowed them to do all types of things, including a sail for 3,000 to 4,000 miles before returning to base. They fired a torpedo. They oftentimes also surfaced if they came upon an unarmed merchantman and they had a gun on the top. They would generally ask the ship to surrender. If they didn't, they would blow it up. Even if they did surrender, they would put them out in lifeboats and then sink the ship. Submarines were a great weapon. At a cost of less than 200 submarines during the entire war, the German Army, or German Navy, excuse me, sunk 5,000 ships. 5,000 ships were sunk with a loss of only 200 German submarines. We're going to see the submarine also be very, very notable in World War II and a key to some of the naval battles that will occur during that time period. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the protection that a soldier would have in World War I. And you can see here soldiers in a trench, and you see that they're wearing helmets. Those items there in their front are protective masks. So this photo was probably taken in 1917 or 1918. The first item, though, I'd like to talk about that gave the soldiers some protection. Unlike any other war, people started wearing hard helmets. And here are two helmets. One is a French helmet used in World War I, and here is a German helmet. The German helmet is actually a helmet that I found from World War II, but it is identical to a World War I helmet with just a few slight modifications. So those are the types of helmets. Well, why do people wear helmets? It's not, as many people think, to stop bullets. Okay, it will not stop a bullet from going through directly. It will sometimes stop a piece of shrapnel if it glances off like that, because the shrapnel isn't traveling as fast as a bullet would be traveling. But most importantly, helmets offered protection because of the tremendous artillery barrages. Great amounts of dirt, rocks, and other items will be blown up in the air and land on the soldiers. And so because of that, those helmets were very, very valuable. Also, they would stop this piece of this item. This item was placed in an artillery shell, and there were generally about 60 of these placed in an artillery shell, and they were exploded on purpose over a trench because the trench offered protection to the soldiers. And so the artillery shell was set, its fuse was set to blow up over the trench and rain these small lead balls down. And these balls also I found in France. But a helmet would actually protect you from these lead balls. If you didn't have the helmet on, obviously you would suffer a grievous or even a fatal wound.
What else would be included in a World War I soldier's kit?
Other things that would be included were they would have a very, very rudimentary first aid kit. As I mentioned before, a large gauze bandage would be in there. There'd be another thing they had was always a jackknife. The jackknife was an invention of the Civil War, okay, a knife that folded. They would have an ammunition belt that every soldier would carry anywhere between 100 to 150 rounds of ammunition that he would use for his rifle. And then he would have other items. He might have a mess kit. He might have binoculars if he was an officer. These are German officers' field binoculars from World War I. He would have a pair of binoculars, but only officers or non-commissioned officers would generally have those binoculars. Those binoculars were also used to help the artillery sight in on the enemy, so that they saw that, in fact, that the artillery rounds were going too far, and they could see with their binoculars and then pass that information back. Also, the bayonet, and I have a bayonet, I'll show it to you next time, I don't have it with me today. I have a bayonet. Generally, bayonets were obviously used only at very, very close quarters. Once the enemy came into the trench, you didn't have time oftentimes to be continually working your weapon, so you would be stabbing people with a bayonet. So those items were very, very popular.
What about food or water, or what kind of things would they be carrying for that?
Food and water generally was supplied in the trenches, okay, and were not carried by the regular soldier. They would have a canteen, okay, but oftentimes soldiers would fill up the canteen with other things other than water, wherever they could find it. And some of those other things were, in fact, spirits, so to speak. Soldiers smoked a lot. They generally rolled their own cigarettes, and they also smoked a pipe a lot in the trenches, because most of the time in the trenches was a very boring time. And they would go for weeks or even months without any attack except artillery raining down on them. And so they would use they would also have boots, and you can see why they needed boots and would have to change their socks. They generally had 3 pair of socks in their kit.